The warm spring sun shone brightly over the peaceful streets of Oak Grove Heights, an upscale neighborhood where beautiful houses lined both sides of the tree-shaded streets. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Dorothy Washington, a 68-year-old retired school teacher, walked slowly but purposefully along the familiar sidewalk she had traveled countless times over the past 30 years. Her silver hair was neatly styled in a bun, and she wore a modest floral dress with comfortable walking shoes. In her hands, she carried two brown paper bags filled with groceries, one for herself and one for her dear friend and neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had been battling cancer for the past few months. As Dorothy walked, she noticed how much the neighborhood had changed recently. Many of her old neighbors had moved away, replaced by younger families who seemed too busy to exchange the friendly waves and greetings that had once been common in Oak Grove Heights. The beautiful Victorian houses were being renovated one by one, turning into modern showpieces that looked nothing like the warm homes she remembered. Through the large windows of these renovated houses, Dorothy could see unfamiliar faces watching her. Some quickly drew their curtains closed when she looked their way. Others simply stared, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and discomfort. Dorothy tried not to let it bother her, though her heart grew heavy at how different things felt now. She shifted the weight of her grocery bags and paused to rest for a moment near the Thompson house, though it wasn't the Thompson house anymore. The new owners had painted over its cheerful yellow color with a stark gray and installed security cameras that seemed to follow her every move. Dorothy remembered how old Mr. Thompson used to sit on the porch every afternoon, offering cookies to children walking home from school. As she continued walking, Dorothy's mind wandered to happier memories. She thought about her 32 years of teaching at Oak Grove Elementary School, where she had taught hundreds of children who now had children of their own. Just last week, she had run into Tommy Martinez, now Dr. Thomas Martinez, at the grocery store. He had given her a big hug and thanked her for encouraging his love of science when he was in her fourth grade class. The grocery bags were getting heavier, but Mrs. Chen's house was just 2 blocks away. Dorothy had started bringing groceries to her friend ever since the cancer treatments had made it difficult for Mrs. Chen to shop for herself. Today, she had picked up some fresh vegetables for soup, Mrs. Chen's favorite ginger tea, and a small chocolate cake as a treat. Dorothy looked up at the sound of a door quickly closing. A woman in yoga clothes had been watching her from her front step and had hurried inside when Dorothy noticed her. Through the window, Dorothy could see the woman speaking on her phone, glancing outside repeatedly with what looked like concern on her face. "Lord, give me strength," Dorothy muttered under her breath, but kept her head high and continued walking. She had lived in this neighborhood long before most of these people had even heard of Oak Grove Heights. This was her home, and she refused to feel like a stranger here. The afternoon was growing warmer, and Dorothy could feel sweat forming on her forehead. She adjusted her grip on the grocery bags again, making sure the eggs she bought for Mrs. Chen's protein-rich diet weren't getting jostled too much. The doctor had been very specific about Mrs. Chen needing to eat well to keep up her strength during the treatments. As she approached the corner where she needed to turn, Dorothy noticed more curtains moving in windows and more faces peering out at her. Some residents who had been working in their front yard suddenly found reasons to go inside. A man washing his car stopped what he was doing and picked up his phone, his eyes following her movement down the street. Dorothy thought about how different things were now from when she and her late husband James had first moved into the neighborhood. Back then, they had been one of the first black families in Oak Grove Heights, but their neighbors had welcomed them with open arms and home-baked pies. Now, 3 decades later, she felt like a stranger in her own community. Still, Dorothy held on to her dignity and grace, qualities she had taught her students about for so many years. She was nearly at Mrs. Chen's house now, and the thought of her friend's grateful smile was enough to help her ignore the unwelcoming stares. What she didn't notice, however, was the police car that had just turned onto her street, responding to a call about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. Inside her newly renovated 3-story house, Sarah Mitchell paced back and forth in her pristine white kitchen. Her manicured fingers gripped her iPhone tightly as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher. Through her large bay window, she kept watching the elderly black woman walking down the street with grocery bags. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in our neighborhood," Sarah said, her voice carrying an edge of what she told herself was concern. "There's this woman walking around, looking at all the houses. She's been going very slowly, like she's checking things out." The dispatcher's voice remained professionally calm. "Can you describe this person, ma'am?" "She's an older black woman, probably in her 60s or 70s, Sarah replied, watching Dorothy pause to adjust her grocery bags. "She's carrying some bags, but I don't recognize her. We've had some break-ins in the area recently, and you can never be too careful these days." The dispatcher typed notes into her computer. "Ma'am, is this person doing anything specifically suspicious besides walking and carrying bags?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. "Well, she keeps stopping and looking at houses, and I've never seen her before. This is an upscale neighborhood, and we need to protect our property values. Better safe than sorry, right?" At the police station across town, the call was received as a low-priority report. Most officers would have marked it for routine patrol follow-up. However, officers James Barrett and Michael Reynolds, who were just finishing up their lunch break at a nearby diner, picked up the call on their radio. "Unit 247 responding," Officer Barrett said into his radio, wiping sandwich crumbs from his uniform. He turned to his partner with a smirk. "Let's check this out. Probably another one of those lost people in the wrong neighborhood." Officer Reynolds nodded, starting up their patrol car. Both men had been on the force for 15 years, and both had multiple complaints in their personnel files, mostly from minority residents alleging harassment and excessive force. The department had moved them to patrol duty in affluent areas, hoping to minimize conflicts. "Remember last week?" Barrett said as they drove. "That kid delivering Amazon packages. Bet he won't mix up his routes again after our little chat." Reynolds chuckled, turning onto Oak Grove Heights Main Street. "These rich folks pay a lot in taxes. Least we can do is keep their neighborhood clean." The word carried an ugly weight in his mouth. Back in her kitchen, Sarah had called her neighbor Jessica, who lived 3 houses down. "I just called the police," she said, still watching through her window. "Did you see this woman? She's been walking up and down our street." Jessica, who had also recently moved to the neighborhood, was already looking out her own window. "Oh my God, yes, I saw her earlier. She definitely doesn't live around here." "Did you see how she was looking at the Thompsons' new security system?" Neither woman noticed the "Welcome to Oak Grove Heights" plaque in the local library's display case, which showed Dorothy Washington receiving a Community Service Award 15 years ago. They didn't see the photos of her teaching at Oak Grove Elementary, or the newspaper clipping about her organizing the neighborhood's first multicultural food festival 20 years ago. As Officers Barrett and Reynolds approached the neighborhood, they spotted Dorothy walking slowly with her grocery bags. Barrett picked up his radio. "Dispatch, we have eyes on the suspect. African-American female, elderly, carrying bags. Going to make contact and investigate." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Unit 247, be advised this is a non-emergency call. Subject is merely walking with groceries. No suspicious activity reported beyond presence in neighborhood." "Copy that," Barrett responded, but exchanged a knowing look with his partner. They had already decided how this would go. Meanwhile, Sarah had now group texted several other neighbors, warning them about the suspicious person and proudly announcing that she had called the police. Within minutes, curtains twitched in windows all along the street as residents watched Dorothy's slow progress toward Mrs. Chen's house. The police car turned onto the street, its engine rumbling quietly. Dorothy, focused on managing her heavy grocery bags and thinking about Mrs. Chen's upcoming doctor's appointment, didn't notice the vehicle slowly approaching behind her. She also didn't see the officers' expressions as they stepped out of their car, faces set with the kind of prejudice that no amount of diversity training had managed to erase. The sound of car doors slamming made Dorothy Washington turn around slowly. She saw 2 police officers approaching her with their hands resting near their weapons. Her heart began to beat faster, but she kept her composure, something she had learned to do over her many years of dealing with prejudice. "Ma'am, stop right there," Officer Barrett called out, his voice unnecessarily loud for the quiet street. "Put those bags down slowly and show us your hands." Dorothy looked at the officers with confusion but remained calm. "Is something wrong, officers?" she asked, her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. She carefully placed her grocery bags on the ground, making sure the eggs wouldn't break. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood," Officer Reynolds said, moving to stand slightly behind her. What are you doing in this area? Dorothy straightened her back, her dignity intact despite the humiliation of being questioned on her own street. I live here, officers. I've been a resident of Oak Grove Heights for 30 years. My house is just 3 blocks from here. Officer Barrett scoffed, pulling out his notepad. Right, and I'm the Queen of England. Let's see some ID. Through the windows of nearby houses, faces pressed against the glass. Sarah Mitchell, who had made the call, was recording everything on her phone, feeling justified in her suspicions. Other neighbors were starting to come out onto their porches, drawn by the commotion. My ID is in my purse, Dorothy said calmly, reaching for her bag. But before she could get to it, Officer Reynolds grabbed her arm roughly. Keep your hands where we can see them, he shouted, causing Dorothy to wince in pain as his grip tightened on her arthritic arm. Please, Dorothy said, her voice shaking slightly now. You're hurting me. My ID is right here, and I'm just trying to deliver groceries to my sick neighbor, Mrs. Chen. Sure you are, Officer Barrett sneered. And these groceries, did you pay for them? You have a receipt. Dorothy felt tears forming in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Yes, I had the receipt from Wilson's Market. It's in one of the bags. I've been shopping there every Thursday for years. You can call them to verify. As the officers continued their aggressive questioning, one of Dorothy's grocery bags tipped over. Oranges rolled across the sidewalk, and the carton of eggs she had so carefully protected cracked open, its contents spreading across the concrete. Now look what you made happen, Officer Reynolds said, still holding her arm. This is what we get for trying to be nice about this. Dorothy's voice rose slightly, her patience wearing thin. I don't understand why you're treating me this way. I've lived here longer than most people on this street. I taught at Oak Grove Elementary for over 30 years. My late husband was a respected doctor at Memorial Hospital. Ma'am, your attitude isn't helping, Officer Barrett said, reaching for his handcuffs. If you can't provide ID immediately, we're going to have to take you in. Dorothy looked around at the faces watching from windows and porches. She recognized some of her former students' parents, but they quickly looked away when her eyes met theirs. Only Mrs. Peterson, another longtime resident, had stepped off her porch and was hurrying toward the scene with her phone in hand. I was just trying to help my friend, Dorothy said, her voice trembling but still dignified. Mrs. Chen has cancer. She can't shop for herself right now. I bring her groceries every Thursday. A likely story, Officer Reynolds said, tightening his grip further. We've heard every excuse in the book. Dorothy's grocery receipt flew out of the fallen bag, carried by a gentle breeze. It danced across the perfectly manicured lawn of a house where she had once been welcome for countless neighborhood barbecues. Now, its new owners watched from behind their security cameras as she stood surrounded by her spilled groceries, held by officers who saw her only as a threat, not as the beloved teacher and neighbor she had been for 3 decades. The sound of more car doors slamming echoed down the street as additional police units arrived, their presence casting long shadows over the scattered oranges and broken eggs. A simple act of kindness now turned into a scene of unnecessary force and prejudice. Mrs. Peterson's hands shook as she filmed the scene unfolding before her. She had known Dorothy Washington for decades, but her voice seemed stuck in her throat as she watched the officer's rough treatment of her friend. More neighbors had gathered now, creating a small crowd that maintained a cautious distance from the confrontation. I'm going to reach for my phone, Dorothy said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. I can call Mrs. Chen right now. She'll tell you that I bring her groceries every week. Do not reach for anything, Officer Barrett shouted, yanking Dorothy's arm behind her back. The sudden movement sent shooting pain through her arthritic shoulder, causing her to cry out. The sound of Dorothy's pain finally broke Mrs. Peterson's silence. Stop it, she called out. That's Dorothy Washington. She's lived here for decades. Officer Reynolds turned toward Mrs. Peterson, his hand still gripping Dorothy's arm. Ma'am, stay back. This is police business. If you interfere, you'll be arrested for obstruction. More phones had appeared in windows and doorways, their cameras recording every moment. Sarah Mitchell, who had made the initial call, stood on her front lawn with a confused expression. This wasn't going the way she had imagined when she reported a suspicious person. Dorothy tried once more to reason with the officers. Please, just let me show you my ID. It's right here in my purse. Or we can walk to my house. It's just 3 blocks away. Anyone here who's lived in the neighborhood more than a few years knows me. Your attitude is making this worse, Officer Barrett said, reaching for his handcuffs. Put your hands behind your back. My attitude. Dorothy's voice rose slightly. Decades of dignity fighting against the humiliation. I'm a 68-year-old woman carrying groceries to help a sick friend. How should my attitude be when I'm being treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood? The handcuffs clicked around Dorothy's wrists, cold metal pressing against her thin skin. She winced as they were tightened unnecessarily. Her arthritis made the position excruciating, but her complaints about the pain were ignored. Mrs. Peterson had moved closer, still filming. I'm calling the police chief right now, she announced. This is absolutely ridiculous. I've known Dorothy for 30 years. Other neighbors had begun to murmur among themselves. Some of the newer residents, who had initially watched with suspicion, were now looking uncomfortable as they witnessed the officer's aggressive behavior toward an elderly woman. She really does live here, a young voice called out from the crowd. It was Tommy Martinez's son, a teenager who recognized his father's former teacher. She taught my dad in 4th grade. Officer Reynolds turned to address the growing crowd. Everyone needs to step back and clear the area. This is an official police investigation. Dorothy stood as straight as she could despite the pain in her shoulders. Officer, my friend is waiting for these groceries. She needs to eat before taking her cancer medication. Please, just verify my identity. This is unnecessary. What's unnecessary is your continued resistance, Officer Barrett said, starting to guide her toward the police car. The eggs Dorothy had bought lay broken on the sidewalk, their contents mixing with the oranges that had rolled into the street. Sarah Mitchell had moved closer to Mrs. Peterson. I just thought she looked suspicious, she said weakly. I didn't mean for this to happen. Mrs. Peterson turned to her sharply. Suspicious? What exactly looked suspicious about an elderly woman carrying groceries? Or did you mean something else? From down the street came the sound of a door opening. A frail voice called out, Dorothy? Are you coming with my groceries? It was Mrs. Chen, standing in her doorway in her robe, looking confused at the scene before her. But the officers were already pushing Dorothy into the back of their patrol car, ignoring her continued attempts to explain. Her dignified composure finally cracked as tears rolled down her cheeks, not from the physical pain, but from the shame of being treated this way in the community she had served and loved for so many years. Mrs. Chen's small figure trembled as she made her way down the sidewalk, one hand gripping her walker and the other holding onto her neighbor's arm for support. Despite her weakness from recent chemotherapy treatments, she moved as quickly as she could toward the police car where Dorothy sat handcuffed. What are you doing to my friend? Mrs. Chen called out, her voice weak but determined. Dorothy brings me groceries every Thursday. She has been doing this since my cancer diagnosis 6 months ago. Officer Barrett turned toward the approaching woman, his expression showing the first signs of uncertainty. Ma'am, please stay back. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern me. Mrs. Chen's voice grew stronger with anger. The woman you have in handcuffs has been my neighbor for 25 years. She brings me food, drives me to chemotherapy appointments, and makes sure I take my medications on time. More neighbors were emerging from their homes now, including Mr. Rodriguez, who had lived in Oak Grove Heights for over 2 decades. He walked up to the officers, holding his phone with a photo displayed on the screen. Look at this, he said firmly. This is from last year's neighborhood picnic. There's Dorothy Washington, organizing the whole event like she has for the past 15 years. He swiped through more photos showing Dorothy at various community events, always helping, always contributing. Mrs. Peterson had finally gotten through to the police chief on her phone. Chief Williams. Yes, your officers have just handcuffed Dorothy Washington. Yes, the same Dorothy Washington who tutored your daughter in math 10 years ago. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, loosening his grip on the car door. Inside, Dorothy sat quietly, her dignity intact despite the tears that had dried on her cheeks. Through the window, she could see more familiar faces approaching, faces of people who knew the truth. Sarah Mitchell, who had made the initial call, now stood with her hand covering her mouth in horror. Her next-door neighbor, an older resident, was showing her a framed photograph from her house. It was a picture of Dorothy receiving the Oak Grove Heights Citizen of the Year award in 2010. She's not just any resident, the neighbor explained, her voice sharp with disapproval. Mrs. Washington has been the heart of this community for decades. She organized meals for my family when my husband was in the hospital last year. More evidence of Dorothy's deep roots in the community kept emerging. Tommy Martinez's son had run home and returned with his father's fourth-grade class photo, showing a younger Dorothy Washington surrounded by smiling students. Another neighbor brought out a local newspaper article about Dorothy's retirement from teaching, celebrating her 32 years of service to Oak Grove Elementary. Mrs. Chen had finally reached the police car. Despite her weakness, she stood tall, facing the officers. "Open that door right now," she demanded. "The only suspicious activity happening here is your treatment of a respected member of our community." Officer Barrett's radio crackled to life. The police chief's voice came through clearly. "Unit 247, release Mrs. Washington immediately. I know her personally. This is a serious mistake." As Officer Reynolds reluctantly opened the car door to remove the handcuffs, more pieces of Dorothy's life in Oak Grove Heights came to light. The mail carrier stopped his truck to tell the officers about how Dorothy always kept water bottles for him during hot summer days. A teenage girl arrived with her mother, explaining how Dorothy still volunteered at the library's reading program every Wednesday. The truth wasn't just emerging, it was flooding out from every corner of the neighborhood. Each story, each photograph, each testimonial revealed the same thing. The suspicious person the officers had handcuffed was actually one of the most beloved and dedicated members of the community. The handcuffs finally came off, leaving angry red marks on Dorothy's wrists. As she stepped out of the police car, Mrs. Chen reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. The scattered groceries still lay on the sidewalk, a sad testament to how quickly prejudice could destroy a simple act of kindness. The emergency room lights buzzed overhead as a doctor gently examined Dorothy's wrists. Purple bruises had already started forming where the handcuffs had been too tight. Mrs. Chen sat beside her friend in a wheelchair, refusing to leave despite her own exhaustion from chemotherapy. "You'll need to wear these wrist braces for at least a week," the doctor said, carefully wrapping Dorothy's swollen joints. "The handcuffs aggravated your arthritis significantly. I'm documenting everything for your records." Outside the hospital room, reporters from local news stations had gathered. The videos of Dorothy's arrest had gone viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of angry comments. The hashtag Justice for Dorothy was trending across the city. Dorothy's phone kept buzzing with messages. Former students, fellow teachers, and community members were all reaching out, but her hands hurt too much to reply. Mrs. Chen had been answering calls for her, including one from the mayor himself, who was deeply disturbed by the incident. "I don't want all this attention," Dorothy said quietly, looking at her bandaged wrists. "I just wanted to bring you your groceries, Alice." She used Mrs. Chen's first name, something she only did when they were alone. Mrs. Chen patted her friend's arm gently. "Sometimes attention is necessary for change, Dorothy. What they did to you was wrong. All these years of kindness, and they treated you like a criminal in your own neighborhood." The hospital room door opened, and Chief Williams walked in, his face heavy with concern. He had known Dorothy for years. She had indeed tutored his daughter in math, helping her get into college. "Mrs. Washington," he began, removing his hat, "I came personally to apologize for my officers' behavior. They've been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." Dorothy looked at him tiredly. "Will it make any difference, Chief Williams? This isn't the first time something like this has happened in our city. It's just the first time it happened to someone people know." Before the chief could respond, a young nurse rushed in with her phone. "Mrs. Washington, you need to see this." She pulled up a news website showing Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had made the original 911 call, holding a tearful press conference outside the police station. "I was wrong," Sarah was saying, her voice shaking. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I didn't bother to know my neighbors before judging them. Mrs. Washington has done more for this community than I ever have, and I'm deeply ashamed of my actions." Dorothy watched the screen silently. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her church. They were organizing a prayer vigil outside the hospital. Already, hundreds of people had gathered, holding candles and signs supporting her. The doctor returned with discharge papers, but also with concerning news. Mrs. Washington, your blood pressure is still elevated from the stress of the incident. I'm prescribing medication and recommending you take it easy for the next few weeks. Mrs. Chen spoke up firmly. She's staying with me. I have a guest room, and for once, I can take care of her instead of her always taking care of me. Through the hospital window, they could see more people arriving outside. The crowd now included many of Dorothy's former students, some holding up old class photos. There were also neighbors from Oak Grove Heights, both old and new residents, standing together in solidarity. Dorothy's hands throbbed in their braces as she signed the discharge papers. Each movement was a painful reminder of how quickly prejudice could turn a simple act of kindness into a nightmare. But as she looked at the growing crowd outside, she saw something else too, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, her painful experience could help open eyes and change hearts. You know what hurts the most? She said softly to Mrs. Chen. Tomorrow is Thursday again, and I won't be able to carry your groceries. Mrs. Chen squeezed her friend's shoulder gently. Don't worry about that. Look outside. I think we have plenty of volunteers who would be happy to help both of us now. The emergency room lights buzzed overhead as the doctor gently examined Dorothy's wrists. Purple bruises had already started forming where the handcuffs had been too tight. Mrs. Chen sat beside her friend in a wheelchair, refusing to leave despite her own exhaustion from chemotherapy. You'll need to wear these wrist braces for at least a week, the doctor said, carefully wrapping Dorothy's swollen joints. The handcuffs aggravated your arthritis significantly. I'm documenting everything for your records. Outside the hospital room, reporters from local news stations had gathered. The videos of Dorothy's arrest had gone viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of angry comments. The hashtag Justice for Dorothy was trending across the city. Dorothy's phone kept buzzing with messages. Former students, fellow teachers, and community members were all reaching out, but her hands hurt too much to reply. Mrs. Chen had been answering calls for her, including one from the mayor himself, who was deeply disturbed by the incident. I don't want all this attention, Dorothy said quietly, looking at her bandaged wrists. I just wanted to bring you your groceries, Alice. She used Mrs. Chen's first name, something she only did when they were alone. Mrs. Chen patted her friend's arm gently. Sometimes attention is necessary for change, Dorothy. What they did to you was wrong. All these years of kindness, and they treated you like a criminal in your own neighborhood. The hospital room door opened, and Chief Williams walked in, his face heavy with concern. He had known Dorothy for years. She had indeed tutored his daughter in math, helping her get into college. Mrs. Washington, he began, removing his hat. I came personally to apologize for my officers' behavior. They've been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Dorothy looked at him tiredly. Will it make any difference, Chief Williams? This isn't the first time something like this has happened in our city. It's just the first time it happened to someone people know. Before the chief could respond, a young nurse rushed in with her phone. Mrs. Washington, you need to see this. She pulled up a news website showing Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had made the original 911 call, holding a tearful press conference outside the police station. I was wrong, Sarah was saying, her voice shaking. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I didn't bother to know my neighbors before judging them. Mrs. Washington has done more for this community than I ever have, and I'm deeply ashamed of my actions. Dorothy watched the screen silently. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her church. They were organizing a prayer vigil outside the hospital. Already, hundreds of people had gathered, holding candles and signs supporting her. The doctor returned with discharge papers, but also with concerning news. Mrs. Washington, your blood pressure is still elevated from the stress of the incident. I'm prescribing medication and recommending you take it easy for the next few weeks. Mrs. Chen spoke up firmly. She's staying with me. I have a guest room, and for once, I can take care of her instead of her always taking care of me. Through the hospital window, they could see more people arriving outside. The crowd now included many of Dorothy's former students, some holding up old class photos. There were also neighbors from Oak Grove Heights, both old and new residents, standing together in solidarity. Dorothy's hands throbbed in their braces as she signed the discharge papers. Each movement was a painful reminder of how quickly prejudice could turn a simple act of kindness into a nightmare. But as she looked at the growing crowd outside, she saw something else too, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, her painful experience could help open eyes and change hearts. "You know what hurts the most?" she said softly to Mrs. Chen. "Tomorrow is Thursday again, and I won't be able to carry your groceries." Mrs. Chen squeezed her friend's shoulder gently. "Don't worry about that. Look outside. I think we have plenty of volunteers who would be happy to help both of us now." 3 months after the incident, Oak Grove Heights had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Dorothy Washington sat on her front porch, watching the neighborhood's first community walking group pass by. New and longtime residents walked together, chatting and laughing, a sight that would have been unimaginable just months ago. The investigation into Officers Barrett and Reynolds had concluded last week. Both had been terminated from the police force, and the department had implemented strict new protocols for responding to suspicious person calls. But more importantly, the incident had sparked a deeper change in the community itself. Dorothy's wrists had healed, though her arthritis still bothered her on cold days. She no longer delivered groceries alone, not because she couldn't, but because so many neighbors had insisted on helping. Today, it was young Sarah Mitchell's turn to accompany her on the weekly delivery to Mrs. Chen. "The vegetables look especially fresh today," Sarah said, carefully arranging items in her carrying bag. She had become one of Dorothy's most dedicated volunteers, turning her guilt into genuine commitment to change. Dorothy smiled, remembering how far they'd come from that terrible day. "Mrs. Chen will be happy. Her doctor says her latest tests are showing improvement." She picked up her own lighter bag, her movements careful but confident. The Dorothy Washington Community Bridge Program had become a model for other neighborhoods. Over 50 new families had been paired with longtime residents, creating connections that went far beyond simple introductions. The local news had done a follow-up story just last week, highlighting how the program was helping to prevent similar incidents in other communities. As they walked toward Mrs. Chen's house, Dorothy and Sarah passed the Thompson house, now a regular stop on the neighborhood's new history walking tour. The current owners had replaced their security cameras with flower boxes and resumed the old tradition of offering cookies to passing schoolchildren. "Did you see the police chief's announcement?" Sarah asked as they walked. "They're making your story part of their mandatory training program. Every new officer will learn about what happened here." Dorothy nodded. The civil rights attorneys had helped her reach a settlement with the police department, but she had insisted that the money go toward community programs and better police training. "It's not about punishing people," she had told them. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." They passed Mr. Rodriguez's house, where he was teaching new residents about proper rose pruning, another initiative of the Community Bridge Program. Every weekend, different neighbors shared their skills and knowledge, from gardening to cooking to home maintenance. Mrs. Chen was waiting on her porch, looking stronger than she had in months. Her cancer treatments were going well, and the doctor credited her improved spirits to the amazing support system that had developed around her. The incident had revealed not just the problems in their community, but also its tremendous capacity for growth and healing. "Look what I brought," Mrs. Chen called out, holding up a photo album. Inside were pictures from last week's first annual Oak Grove Heights Unity Festival, an event that had drawn over 1,000 people from across the city. The photo on the first page showed Dorothy cutting the ribbon, her formerly bruised wrists now raised in triumph. As they settled on Mrs. Chen's porch with iced tea, Dorothy looked out at her transformed neighborhood. Children played freely on the sidewalks, neighbors greeted each other by name, and front doors stood open in welcome rather than closed in suspicion. Sometimes, Dorothy said softly, good things can grow from painful moments, like flowers pushing through concrete. Sarah reached over and squeezed Dorothy's hand gently. You taught us that, Mrs. Washington. You showed us how to turn hurt into healing. A new family was moving in down the street. Already, neighbors were heading over with welcome baskets and introduction packets. The sight brought tears to Dorothy's eyes, not tears of pain like that terrible day 3 months ago, but tears of joy at seeing her longtime dream of a truly united community finally becoming reality. The incident that could have broken their neighborhood had instead transformed it. Dorothy Washington's 30 years of quiet dedication have finally bloomed into something beautiful, a community where dignity, respect, and connection triumphed over prejudice and fear.